Welcome to Sleepy Whisper. Please set your volume to a gentle level, find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let the world around you fade into silence. Together, we'll drift into sleep with the very first story in our Boring History for Sleep series, The Sky Charts of Babylon. If you enjoy this peaceful journey, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories to lull you into rest. Long before the modern maps of the sky that we can find in glossy books or on glowing computer screens, there were the people of Babylon, an ancient city built along the fertile banks of the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq, where the rhythm of life followed the slow turning of the seasons and the gentle but persistent flow of water. In those days, thousands of years ago, the night sky was not a distant curiosity, but a constant presence overhead. An immense dark dome scattered with points of light that shifted from evening to evening, marking the passage of time with a precision that no man-made clock could rival. The Babylonians were among the first to treat those patterns of stars not merely as decorations in the heavens, but as a great chart, a guide that could be read and understood, a tool that could help them predict the flooding of rivers, the ripening of crops, and the arrival of important religious festivals. They built tall ziggurats, stepped towers that rose above the city's flat rooftops, giving their sky watchers a higher vantage point from which to observe the movements of the stars and planets. Night after night, these observers would climb the steps, carrying clay tablets and reed styluses, and patiently record what they saw. They would note where the moon appeared in relation to the bright constellations. They would measure the slow wanderings of Jupiter and Saturn, and they would pay particular attention to strange occurrences such as eclipses, which they believed could carry messages from the gods. Over centuries, their records grew into one of the oldest continuous sets of astronomical data in human history. The clay tablets, many of which have survived buried beneath layers of earth, reveal a meticulous approach to observation, with careful lists of rising and setting times, angular distances, and even predictions of future events. These were not casual notes. They were the work of a civilization that valued order and sought to understand the regularity behind the apparent chaos of the night sky. The Babylonians divided the sky into sections along what we now call the zodiac, marking the path along which the sun, moon, and planets travel. Each section was associated with particular stars, and these divisions allowed them to create a framework for charting celestial events. In time, their system influenced the Greeks and, through them, much of the Western world's astronomical tradition. But in its earliest form, it was deeply woven into the life of Babylon itself. Farmers relied on the timing suggested by the sky charts to know when to plant barley and wheat. Priests consulted them to determine the most auspicious dates for ceremonies. Kings listened to court astronomers who would interpret unusual patterns as omens, advising on whether to go to war, sign a treaty, or prepare for famine. To stand on a Babylonian ziggurat on a warm, dry night and look upward was to participate in a practice older than most cities in the world, a patient watching and recording that connected human life to the slow dance of the cosmos. The air at such heights would have been still, broken only by the soft scratch of a stylus on clay and the faint murmur of the city below. Fires burned in the distance, and the river, though unseen in the darkness, would have whispered softly, a reminder of the earthbound concerns that depended on these heavenly observations. The constellations the Babylonians named were not exactly the same as ours, but many have echoes in our current star maps. The lion, the bull, the scorpion. These creatures crossed cultural lines and endured through time. Their sky charts were not art for its own sake. They were a fusion of science, religion, and administration, a testament to the way human curiosity could be harnessed for practical ends. Even now, when we look at the night sky and recognize the patterns of the zodiac, we are in some small way looking through Babylonian eyes, seeing the same eternal canopy that they once mapped with such care, and feeling, if only faintly, the same quiet pull of wonder that must have accompanied them as they worked, night after night, under the endless and patient stars. As the centuries passed in Babylon, the art of charting the sky grew steadily more sophisticated, shaped by the steady patience of generations who devoted their lives to watching the heavens. The earliest sky records were simple lists of appearances and disappearances, of the moon rising in a certain place or a bright planet shining near a familiar star. But over time, the Babylonians began to see repeating cycles hidden within these movements. They realized that the moon's phases followed a pattern of roughly 29.5 days, and that this cycle could be used to predict when the crescent would return, or when the full moon would once again flood the night with light. They tracked the slow loops of planets, noting that some appeared to pause and reverse direction in the sky before continuing on their way, a strange motion we now call retrograde. To the Babylonians, such events were not mere curiosities. They were part of a great conversation between the heavens and the earth, signs that might carry meaning for the city's future. Skilled astronomer priests known as umanu worked in the service of kings and temples, compiling great collections of these observations on clay tablets stored in archives. Some tablets were written in cuneiform so fine and precise that even today, thousands of years later, the wedge-shaped impressions are still sharp to the eye and clear to the touch. These records included not only raw data, but also interpretations, forecasts of eclipses, and even mathematical schemes for predicting planetary positions. In doing so, the Babylonians took a decisive step from simple sky watching toward what we now recognize as scientific astronomy. They began to use numerical methods to calculate where a planet would appear months or even years into the future, allowing them to prepare for the omens such events might bring. Their sky charts became essential tools in the administration of the city, intertwined with law, agriculture, and religion. When the Euphrates threatened to flood, or when harvests failed, the people would look upward, searching for clues in the arrangement of the stars. A rare alignment or an unexpected eclipse could be interpreted as a warning from the gods, prompting changes in policy or ritual offerings meant to restore balance. In the stillness of a Babylonian night, on the high platform of a ziggurat, a scribe might lift his eyes from the damp clay to study a faint red point shimmering in the darkness, recognizing it as Mars and marking its position with care. Around him, the quiet city stretched out, its streets lit here and there by oil lamps, its houses closed against the cool air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog might bark, or the faint sound of a lyre might drift upward from a courtyard where someone sang to pass the time. The rest was silence, broken only by the murmur of voices among the watchers and the slow, deliberate pressing of cymbals into clay. These night vigils were not hurried affairs. They demanded patience, for the stars moved slowly, and the changes worth recording sometimes took hours to unfold. In this way, the Babylonians trained themselves to see not just the obvious but the subtle, to notice the faint glimmer of a rising star barely clearing the horizon, or the way the light of Venus shifted from one side of the sun to the other over many months. Through these patient studies, their sky charts became both more accurate and more deeply tied to the rhythms of their society. They began to divide the year into months based on lunar cycles, adjusting their calendar to keep it in step with the seasons, and they even marked certain constellations as reference points to measure the progress of time. When traders and travelers arrived from distant lands, they often marveled at the Babylonians' ability to predict celestial events, and some carried this knowledge onward, spreading Babylonian influence far beyond the walls of the city. Thus, under the endless dome of stars, a quiet empire of knowledge was built, one that would endure in fragments and echoes long after the towers of Babylon had crumbled into dust, leaving behind only the soft imprint of wedge-shaped writing and the memory of those who once listened to the slow, steady voice of the sky. In the heart of Babylon, the sky charts were not only tools of prediction, but also symbols of stability, binding together the city's sense of order and identity in a world where the forces of nature could be both generous and cruel. The Babylonians lived under a canopy of stars that they believed was crafted by divine hands, and each movement of those celestial bodies was thought to reflect the will of the gods. The sky was like a great tablet upon which the heavens wrote their messages, and it was the task of the trained observers to learn how to read them. Many of these observers came from families who had been doing this work for generations, passing down not only technical skills, but also the disciplined patience required to watch the same horizon night after night, through the changing seasons, through heat and cold, through years that could be prosperous or lean. Their instruments were simple compared to the telescopes we know today, yet they were remarkably effective. They used sighting rods, gnomons for casting shadows during the day, and simple graduated scales to measure angles in the sky. Combined with their meticulous records, these tools allowed them to track the progress of planets along the path of the zodiac, to predict when the moon would rise blood red during a lunar eclipse, and to note the first appearance of certain bright stars that marked the turning of the agricultural year. The Babylonians divided the sky into three great bands: northern, equatorial, and southern, each with its own set of constellations, so that every rising and setting could be recorded in context. To the untrained eye, the sky might have seemed chaotic, but to them, it was a clock and a calendar combined, as precise as the finest water clock in the temple courtyards. Clay tablets recovered from ancient archives reveal detailed star lists, such as the so-called 3 stars each text, which assigned 3 key stars to each month, serving as both seasonal markers and navigational aids for travelers. Other texts, like the famous Mul Apen series, went further, compiling an encyclopedic summary of Babylonian astronomical knowledge, including lengths of daylight, heliacal risings of stars, and methods for calculating the positions of planets. These were the reference works of their time, copied and studied by scholars who might never see the stars themselves from the high platforms of the ziggurats, but who understood their importance in keeping the city in harmony with the cosmos. In daily life, this knowledge meant that a farmer could prepare his fields at the right time, a merchant could plan a caravan before the dangerous heat of summer, and a priest could schedule festivals so that sacred rites would align with celestial events. On clear nights, the watchers would often remain until dawn, their eyes adjusting to the gradual brightening of the eastern sky, marking the final observations before the sun's glare erased the stars. In the cool hours before sunrise, they might speak quietly about the patterns they had seen, or about omens that seemed favorable or troubling. There was a kind of meditative stillness in this work, a recognition that the human span was short, but the movements above were vast and enduring, repeating with a patience that no single lifetime could exhaust. For the Babylonians, to record the sky was to participate in something eternal, to place human memory in line with the memory of the heavens themselves. Each chart they made was more than data. It was a conversation between earth and sky, between the passing generations and the timeless expanse above. And in this conversation lay the foundation of a knowledge that would outlast empires. Even now, when archaeologists study those ancient tablets, they are retracing the same lines that a Babylonian scribe pressed into wet clay under the flickering light of an oil lamp, perhaps glancing upward between symbols to make sure the stars had not shifted since the last careful measurement, perhaps feeling a quiet satisfaction in knowing that what he recorded that night would be read again long after his own name was forgotten. Over time, the Babylonians refined their system of observation until it became one of the most reliable and respected bodies of knowledge in the ancient world, a foundation upon which later civilizations would build their own understanding of the heavens. Their work was not static. Each generation of observers compared their notes with those of their predecessors, adjusting calculations, correcting errors, and adding new insights that had been gleaned from decades of steady observation. This cumulative approach meant that by the height of Babylon's power, their sky charts could predict events with a precision that astonished visiting scholars from far-off lands. When a foreign envoy stood on the terrace of a ziggurat and saw a Babylonian astronomer point to a star and declare the exact day and hour when it would vanish into the sun's glare, only to reappear weeks later at dawn, it must have seemed like a kind of magic. But for the Babylonians, it was simply the result of long patience and careful record-keeping. Their system even accounted for the irregular paths of the planets, whose apparent backward motions across the sky, what we now call retrograde movement, were recognized, recorded, and predicted using mathematical schemes that broke new ground in the history of science. This blend of observation and calculation marked a significant shift from purely omen-based interpretation toward something closer to empirical science, though the two approaches always remained intertwined in Babylonian culture. In the courtyards of temples and the shaded rooms of palaces, astrologers would consult these sky charts alongside sacred texts, interpreting not just the when of a celestial event, but also the what and the why, translating the movements of light into the language of human affairs. It was believed that the stars could influence the fate of kings, the health of the land, and the fortunes of armies, and so a ruler might alter his plans based on a particularly ominous conjunction or a favorable alignment. At the same time, the practical applications continued to serve everyday needs, determining the best times for planting and harvesting, guiding the journeys of caravans and ensuring that religious festivals remained in harmony with the celestial calendar. The tablets themselves were objects of care and value, stored in libraries where the temperature and dryness of the climate helped preserve them for centuries. Each was inscribed with cuneiform characters, pressed into wet clay, then baked or left to harden in the sun. The scribes who created them had steady hands and an eye for precision, for a single misplaced mark could alter the meaning of an entire calculation. In the stillness of a Babylonian night, with the warm air carrying the faint scent of oil lamps and the distant hum of the city, an astronomer might pause between observations to run his fingers lightly over a freshly dried tablet, feeling the cool hardness of the clay and knowing that it held a fragment of the sky, captured in human language. This act of preservation was more than record-keeping. It was a way of anchoring the fleeting beauty of the heavens into the permanence of stone and earth. Even after the falls of Babylon, when new powers rose and old temples crumbled, these tablets survived, buried in the ruins, waiting to be uncovered by the hands of archaeologists thousands of years later. And when they were brought back into the light, their markings still told the same story: the moon's path across the constellations, the slow turning of the planets, the careful division of the year into months and seasons. In reading them today, we step into the place of those ancient watchers, looking up at a night sky that, though distant in time, is the very same one they knew, and we are reminded that the desire to understand our place beneath it is as old as civilization itself. The legacy of Babylonian sky charts did not end with the city's decline. Instead, their knowledge traveled, carried along the trade routes, and through the hands of scribes, scholars, and conquerors who recognized its value. When the Persian Empire absorbed Babylon, the new rulers kept the city's astronomers in service, relying on their expertise to advise on everything from agriculture to state rituals. The accuracy of their predictions continued to earn respect, and the practice of nightly observation persisted, even as political powers shifted. Later, when Alexander the Great's armies arrived and Babylon fell under Hellenistic influence, Greek scholars encountered this vast body of work and were deeply impressed by its precision and scope. They translated many of the cuneiform tablets into Greek, adapting Babylonian methods into their own developing science of astronomy. This exchange of ideas ensured that concepts first recorded under the desert sky of Mesopotamia would echo through the Mediterranean world, influencing figures like Hipparchus and Ptolemy, whose writings would dominate Western astronomy for centuries. Yet the original Babylonian approach was not purely mathematical. It remained rooted in the rhythms of daily life. The rising of a certain star was still a sign to begin planting. The first glimpse of Venus at dawn still marked the approach of a particular festival. The people of Babylon had never separated the sky from the earth. It was all one interconnected system, where human activity was tuned to the steady beat of celestial cycles. This philosophy shaped their art, their religion, and even their architecture, with temples and gates aligned to key astronomical events. The famous Ishtar Gate, with its glazed bricks depicting lions and dragons, was not just a ceremonial entrance, but part of a city plan that reflected cosmic order. On the ziggurats, high above the noise of the streets, the watchers still gathered, their eyes scanning the horizon for the faint glow of a planet about to rise. They might note the thin sliver of a new moon, its curve resting like a bowl in the dark, and record its position against the backdrop of stars, knowing that this moment would be read by others weeks or years later. Each observation was a thread in a tapestry woven over centuries, a fabric of knowledge so strong that even time could not tear it apart. The tablets they left behind speak in a language that requires patience to decode, but once understood, they reveal a people who combined practicality with wonder, discipline with curiosity. They understood that to watch the sky was to measure not only the passage of days, but also the unfolding of history itself, for the stars moved at a pace that dwarfed the rise and fall of kings. To the Babylonians, their charts were not static records, but living guides, updated and refined as new observations came in, just as a river's map changes with each season's flood. In this way, the work never truly ended. It was a continuous dialogue between human hands and the infinite dome above, a conversation carried on in the quiet hours of the night, when most of the city slept and only a few remained awake, standing on the edge of the known world, looking upward. And though centuries have passed since those nights, The same stars still shine in the same patterns, as if waiting for someone to take up the stylus once more and add another line to the story, written in the language of light. As the Hellenistic era unfolded, Babylon remained a city of both memory and learning, its libraries still holding the clay tablets that had been pressed with cuneiform signs centuries before, their surfaces hardened and preserved by time and the dry air. The astronomers who worked there during this later period inherited a tradition so old and so well established that it had become second nature to the city's intellectual life. They continued to climb the ziggurats at night, to mark the positions of the moon, to calculate the intervals between eclipses, and to trace the slow wandering of the planets along the zodiac. These men, often serving under Greek-speaking rulers, blended Babylonian methods with the geometric approaches favored by the Greeks, creating a hybrid system that was both precise and adaptable. Records show that they could predict lunar eclipses not just by noting their cycles, but by applying a deeper mathematical model, something that would eventually influence astronomical thought far beyond Mesopotamia. Still, their nights followed a familiar rhythm. The air would cool after sunset, the reddish glow of the day fading into the indigo of early night. Oil lamps flickered in the streets below, while above, the wide expanse of the sky revealed itself. A scattering of pinprick lights so numerous that the longer one stared, the more stars seemed to emerge from the darkness. The watchers, wrapped in simple cloaks, would stand silently for long periods, their eyes trained to notice even the faintest glimmer of movement or change. They might mark the precise moment when a star cleared the eastern horizon, or when a planet seemed to halt in its path before beginning its retrograde motion. Each note, each small mark pressed into clay, was part of a chain of knowledge stretching back to the city's earliest days. And though the political fortunes of Babylon were waning, the work of the sky watchers carried on with the same quiet dignity, because the sky itself did not change with the rise and fall of empires. The constellations still wheeled above the city in their eternal circuits, untroubled by the disputes of kings or the shifting borders on the ground. Travelers who visited Babylon during this time often spoke of the strange calm of these astronomical vigils, where the business of the world seemed to fall away and only the slow ticking of the cosmic clock remained. In the archives, tablets from different centuries were kept side by side, the older ones worn and darkened, the newer ones lighter and sharply inscribed. Together, they formed a kind of unbroken timeline, a record not just of the heavens, but of the city's persistence in keeping them. The Babylonians understood that while a ruler's reign might last a decade or two, and a city might flourish for a few centuries, the paths of the stars were measured in spans so vast that they humbled even the most ambitious plans. It was this awareness, perhaps, that gave their work its sense of patience and steadiness, the knowledge that the story of the sky was one that could only be read slowly over lifetimes, and that each observer was merely a caretaker for a small part of it. This humility before the heavens was the thread that tied together generations of Babylonian skywatchers, binding them to a purpose that outlived the walls and gates of their city, and leaving behind a legacy that we can still read in clay and in starlight to this day. As the centuries wore on, the physical city of Babylon began to fade, its grand gates and temples weathering under wind, sun, and neglect. Yet the knowledge contained in its sky charts refused to vanish. In the quiet libraries and temple archives, scribes continued to copy the old records, ensuring that each new tablet preserved the accuracy and spirit of the originals. Many of these scribes were trained from youth, learning not only to read and write cuneiform, but also to recognize the patterns of the night sky with an instinct born from countless hours of practice. The apprentices would first stand beside their elders on the ziggurat platforms, listening as each observation was murmured, the stylus pressing those same details into clay moments later. They learned to wait without impatience, to let their eyes adjust to darkness until the faintest stars emerged, to tell the difference between the slow, steady light of a planet and the flickering of a distant star. Even in the later years, when political power shifted away from Babylon and the city's population dwindled, these nightly vigils continued. The observers knew that the heavens did not rush. Their work was a long conversation with time itself. On clear nights, the air above the city was still and dry, carrying with it the faint aroma of baked clay and the distant murmur of the Euphrates. The sound of a reed flute might drift from a lone musician somewhere in the city, mingling with the quiet scratch of stylus on tablet. The constellations rose and set in their familiar paths, the lion prowling across the eastern sky, the scorpion stretching its curved tail above the horizon, reminders that these patterns had guided the lives of countless generations. The Babylonians marked each celestial event with care, from the first sighting of a seasonal star to the complex movements of Jupiter or Saturn, which could take years to trace across the zodiac. They understood that a single misplaced mark could lead to errors that would echo through future predictions, and so they approached their work with a precision that bordered on reverence. The temple storerooms became treasure houses of accumulated knowledge, each tablet a link in the long chain of human curiosity stretching back to the dawn of the city. Even as foreign influences brought new tools, new languages, and new interpretations, the core of the Babylonian method, the patient accumulation of observation, the alignment of earthly life to celestial cycles, remained unchanged. It was this persistence that ensured their work would survive the fall of empires and the forgetting of kings. Long after the last great ruler walked the streets of Babylon, the city's watchers still turned their eyes upward, recording the slow dance of the heavens with the same quiet devotion. And in doing so, they left a map not only of the stars, but of the patience, discipline, and unbroken thread of observation that connected them to those who had stood in the same place centuries before, gazing at the same sky. In the waning days of Babylon's prominence, the city itself became quieter, its once crowded streets less filled with traders, and its grand markets losing some of their old bustle. Yet on the high terraces and ziggurat steps, the watchers still gathered, their eyes turning upward as they had for centuries. These later generations of sky watchers knew they were the heirs to a vast tradition, one that had begun in the deep past when the first clay tablets were inscribed with the positions of stars and planets. They approached their work with the same deliberate patience, standing motionless for long stretches of time, waiting for a faint glimmer to clear the horizon or for a planet to slip behind the moon. The nights in Babylon could be cool and dry, the wind carrying the faint scent of river silt and the far-off aroma of fires burning in the poorer quarters. Above them, the sky opened wide and dark, free of the light that in later ages would dim the stars, and the watchers could see far into the depths of space, following constellations that had been marked and named by their forebears. They knew the stories attached to each group of stars, the myths of lions, bulls, and hunters. But their duty was not to tell tales. It was to measure, to note, and to record with a precision that would allow others to predict where those stars would be in the months and years to come. The clay tablets they used were smooth and slightly cool to the touch when new, gradually hardening as the night wore on and the damp clay dried in the warm air. Each mark they pressed into the surface was a moment captured, a point in the ongoing map of the heavens. The work required a steady hand, for a single line made too shallow or too deep could confuse a reading later on. In the archives, these new records would join the older ones, stored carefully on shelves, sometimes alongside tablets written hundreds of years earlier. A scholar might take down such an ancient tablet, run his fingers lightly over the faded cuneiform, and compare its data with the current observations, noting how the sky had behaved exactly as predicted. This was the satisfaction of Babylonian astronomy. To see the patterns hold, to confirm that the great clock of the heavens kept its time, no matter what changes unfolded below on the earth. Even when the city passed under the control of new empires, the value of this knowledge ensured that the watchers were kept in their posts. Kings and governors still wanted to know when the next eclipse would occur, or when a certain star would rise before dawn, and so the work continued, uninterrupted, as it had for centuries. There was a quiet pride in this continuity, a sense that while walls crumbled and palaces fell, the stars remained, and so did those who mapped them. And in this way, the tradition of Babylonian sky charts reached beyond the lifespan of the city itself, leaving a record that spoke not just of astronomical skill, but of an unbroken human connection to the steady rhythms of the night sky. By the final centuries in which Babylon still stood as a living city, the practice of sky charting had become less a matter of novelty and more a quiet, almost ritualized habit, carried out by a small but devoted circle of scholars who understood that their work was part of something far greater than themselves. Many of these observers were the last in long family lines of astronomers, their knowledge passed down from father to son, from master to apprentice, each generation adding its own layer to the patient accumulation of data. They would climb the worn stone steps of the ziggurats, their sandals scraping softly against the ancient surfaces, and emerge into the cool air at the summit, where the entire sweep of the night sky lay open before them. The air at that height was clear, the stars sharp and steady, and the constellations familiar, patterns that had been charted so many times they felt like old companions. They began each vigil in silence, their eyes adjusting slowly to the dark, waiting until the full spread of the heavens revealed itself. Then the work began, noting the first appearance of a planet at the edge of the horizon, measuring its position relative to a known star, marking its slow movement across nights and weeks. The clay tablets they used were prepared earlier in the day, smooth and slightly damp, ready to take the impressions of the stylus. Each mark was deliberate, the spacing precise, the alignment carefully checked against existing charts. They knew from experience that a single misjudged position could ripple forward into a chain of incorrect predictions, and so they worked without haste, but without pause, methodically building a record that was both accurate and enduring. When a rare event occurred, an eclipse, a bright comet, or a planet's sudden change of direction, it was recorded in detail, often accompanied by notations on its possible significance. Though the purely omen-based interpretations had lessened over the centuries, the idea that the heavens could reflect earthly events never entirely disappeared, and rulers still listened when their astronomers spoke of unusual alignments. Yet more than anything, these late Babylonian watchers seemed to find a quiet satisfaction in the constancy of their work, in the knowledge that they were adding their small part to a story begun long before they were born. The nights could be long and uneventful, the stars moving with their unhurried pace, but there was a kind of peace in this, a sense that the act of simply observing was itself a connection to the vast rhythms of the cosmos. Below, the city might be restless with politics or commerce, but above, the stars followed their ancient paths, indifferent to the rise and fall of human affairs. The observers, wrapped in their cloaks against the cool air, felt that they too belonged to something unchanging, something that would continue long after the last of Babylon's gates had closed. And when their observations were complete, they descended the steps in silence, carrying with them the fresh tablets to be stored alongside the countless others, a library not of books, but of the sky itself, written in clay for any who might one day wish to read the language of the stars, as the Babylonians had. When the last chapters of Babylon's story unfolded, the city no longer commanded the vast empires it once had, and its great halls, temples, and markets stood as weathered reminders of a past age. Yet high in the dusty archives and on the windswept terraces of its ziggurats, the quiet tradition of sky charting lingered on, even as foreign languages echoed in the streets and new rulers imposed their customs. The watchers of the heavens continued their work with the same patience that had guided their predecessors for over 1,000 years. The clay tablets still bore fresh impressions of cuneiform signs, each one a precise record of where the moon had risen, how the planets had moved, and which stars had marked the changing seasons. The air on those nights carried a dry coolness, and the city below seemed muted, its lamps and fires like faint embers compared to the brilliance of the stars above. From their high vantage point, the observers could see the familiar constellations tracing their ancient paths, the lion prowling through the east, the bull lowering its horns in the west, the archer taking aim at the horizon. They understood that these same patterns had been watched by hands and eyes long gone, that their own records would one day be added to a chain stretching into both the past and the future. When the work was complete, the tablets were carefully stored, stacked alongside those from generations before, their baked surfaces cool and smooth, their symbols sharp under the fingers. In time, the ziggurats themselves would crumble, the archives would be buried by centuries of dust and debris, and Babylon would become a place spoken of in legend more than in daily life. Yet the sky charts, sealed in the earth, endured. Thousands of years later, when archaeologists uncovered them, they found the same meticulous rows of markings, the same alignment data, the same careful notes about eclipses, risings, and planetary cycles. In reading them, modern scholars realized they were touching not only clay, but the very thoughts and observations of people who had lived in a world utterly different from ours, yet had looked up at the same sky. The legacy of Babylonian astronomy had traveled far beyond the city's walls, influencing Greek and later Islamic science, and eventually shaping the very foundations of modern astronomy. But perhaps the truest legacy lay not in the mathematics or the predictions, but in the example of patience and continuity that these sky watchers embodied. A reminder that the act of looking up, of seeking to understand the patterns above, connects us across time in a way few other human endeavors can. And so, as we picture them standing on the high platforms under the open sky, their styluses poised over fresh clay, their eyes scanning the horizon for the next movement of light, we can almost feel the stillness they must have known, the sense that in mapping the heavens, they were also placing themselves within the great order of the universe, their work a quiet echo in the endless rhythm of the stars. That concludes our previous story. Before we begin the next one, I'd be grateful if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's continue our journey through the Boring History for Sleep series and turn to our next story, the calendar makers of the Aztec Empire. Long before the arrival of European ships on the shores of what is now Mexico, the Aztec Empire flourished as a complex and highly organized civilization. Its great capital city of Tenochtitlan, rising from the waters of Lake Texcoco, like a vision of stone, wood, and shimmering canals. Life in this city, with its markets filled with cacao, textiles, and brightly painted pottery, with its causeways stretching across the lake and its towering temples reaching toward the sky, was not left to chance or disorder. The movement of daily life was tied closely to an intricate system of timekeeping, a system that had been refined over generations and woven deeply into every aspect of society. At the heart of this system were the calendar makers, skilled specialists whose duty it was to measure, track, and interpret the passage of time. These men, known in Nahuatl as Tonalpukwe, worked within a tradition that combined astronomy, mathematics, and religion into a seamless whole. They were keepers of two main calendars, the Tonalpohualli, a 260-day ritual calendar used for divination and ceremonial purposes, and the Xiuhpohualli, a 365-day solar calendar that tracked the agricultural year. Each day had its place in both cycles, and the interplay between the two formed a larger cycle of 52 years, known as the binding of the years, after which the patterns began anew. The calendar makers observed the rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the appearance of certain stars on the horizon, recording their findings with precision and care. Their work was not done with paper and ink, but with painted codices, long sheets of bark paper or animal hide, folded like accordions and covered with bright pigments, where glyphs, symbols, and colors told the story of time itself. In the calm of early morning, before the bustle of the markets began, a calendar maker might climb the steps of a temple to observe the first light touching the distant mountains, noting exactly where the sun emerged. Such observations were not idle. They determined when to plant maize, when to prepare for harvest, and when to hold the great festivals that honored the gods. The Xiuhpohualli divided the year into 18 months of 20 days each, with an additional 5 empty days at the end, considered unlucky and set apart from ordinary life. The Tonalpohualli, on the other hand, was a sacred cycle made up of 20 named days, each associated with a number from 1 to 13, creating a web of combinations that carried deep meaning for those trained to read them. The calendar makers were respected figures, for they were thought to hold knowledge that connected the human world with the divine. A birth date, a marriage, a journey, or a political decision might all be timed according to their calculations. In the quiet hours after sunset, they would study the darkening sky, watching for the appearance of Venus as the evening star, or waiting for its reappearance as the morning star, an event of great significance in Aztec cosmology. Every observation was made with the understanding that time was not merely a straight line, but a series of repeating patterns, cycles within cycles, each with its own character and influence. The calendar makers did not see themselves as inventors of these cycles, but as interpreters of a cosmic order that already existed, a rhythm set by the gods when the world was created. By keeping this rhythm, they ensured that the life of the empire flowed in harmony with the movements of the heavens, the seasons, and the sacred days that marked the turning of the great wheel of time. In the daily life of Tenochtitlan, the work of the calendar makers was felt in ways both visible and subtle, for every activity from the sowing of maize to the celebration of a royal coronation was guided by their calculations. The Shupohwali, with its 18 regular months, was the backbone of the agricultural year, and each of those months was associated with specific festivals, offerings, and rituals meant to honor the gods and secure their favor. In the month of Atlakahwalo, for example, ceremonies were held to bring rain for the crops, while in Panquetzalisli, great processions and dances honored Huitzilopochtli, the patron god of the Mexica people. These events were not planned casually. They were fixed into the calendar by the Tonopokwe, who ensured that each fell at its proper time according to the sun's position and the cycle of days. Meanwhile, the Tonopohwali wove through this solar framework, providing a sacred rhythm that touched nearly every decision in Aztec life. Each of its 20 named days carried a symbol, such as crocodile, wind, house, or reed, and each was paired with a number from 1 to 13, creating 260 unique combinations before the cycle repeated. For the calendar makers, these combinations were more than names. They were keys to understanding the quality of time. A day of 1 reed might be favorable for setting out on a journey, while a day of 10 death could be seen as ill-suited for beginning a major project. Births were carefully recorded in both calendars, for the combination of day signs and numbers was believed to shape a person's destiny, influencing their strengths, weaknesses, and even their role in the community. In the codices, the Tonopukwe painted these signs with great skill, using colors ground from minerals and plants, each hue carrying symbolic meaning. They were careful in their placement of every glyph, for an error could lead to confusion and mistrust. Observations of the sun's movements were often made from the tops of temples or specially constructed viewing platforms, aligned with significant points on the horizon. When the sun rose or set in a position that matched a temple's sightline, it marked the beginning of a new period in the calendar. The appearance of certain stars or the disappearance of Venus for a set number of days was also recorded, linking the heavens directly to the cycles of the earth. These records were kept not only for practical purposes, but also for historical memory, so that future generations could compare their own observations and maintain the accuracy of the system. The calendar makers worked with a sense of responsibility that went beyond their own lifetimes, knowing that their records were part of an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back to earlier Mesoamerican civilizations, such as the Maya, whose own calendar traditions had influenced their work. In this way, they were guardians not just of timekeeping, but of cultural continuity, ensuring that the empire's life remained in harmony with the cosmic order. As the day ended and the city quieted, the Tonopukwe would sometimes gather to review their notes by the dim light of torches, discussing patterns, checking alignments, and preparing the next day's calculations. Their voices low and measured as the night sky turned slowly overhead, bringing with it the next chapter in the eternal cycle. The work of the Tonalpukwe was not confined to the observation of the sky and the careful maintenance of codices. It was deeply integrated into the fabric of governance, religion, and community life in the Aztec Empire. The rulers of Tenochtitlan depended on these specialists to determine when to conduct major state ceremonies, such as the dedication of a new temple or the commencement of a military campaign. Wars were not launched at random, but were often timed to coincide with dates deemed favorable by the sacred calendar, aligning human action with cosmic harmony. In the temples, priests consulted the Tonopukwe before arranging important rituals, for the sequence of offerings, dances, and chants needed to resonate with the character of the day. Even marriage arrangements could be influenced by their advice, with couples being joined under dates believed to promise harmony and prosperity. The two calendars, the Jupahuali and the Tonalpohuali, intertwined like the gears of a vast and precise mechanism, coming into full alignment every 52 years, in an event known as the New Fire Ceremony. This occasion marked the completion of a full cycle, and it was one of the most significant rituals in the Aztec world. As the end of a cycle approached, a sense of solemn anticipation spread through the city. Fires across Tenochtitlan and the surrounding towns would be extinguished, plunging the empire into darkness for a night. On a sacred hill outside the city, priests and calendar makers gathered to observe the stars, waiting for the moment when the Pleiades reached the center of the sky. If the stars appeared as expected, it was taken as a sign that the sun would rise again and the world would continue for another cycle. A new fire would then be lit and carried to rekindle every hearth in the land, symbolizing renewal and the continuation of cosmic order. For the Tonalpukwe, this ceremony was the ultimate validation of their work, proving that their calculations and observations were in harmony with the movements of the heavens. The accuracy of their system was a source of pride, not only for themselves but for the entire empire, for it demonstrated that the Aztecs were living in accordance with a divine pattern established at the dawn of creation. The tools of their trade were simple but effective: painted codices, knotted cords for counting, and their own trained senses. Standing on high platforms, they used the silhouettes of mountains, the lines of temples, and the distant horizon as markers to track the sun's position through the year. At dawn and dusk, they watched the changing light carefully, noting shifts so subtle that they would go unnoticed by most people. Their records were not stored in isolation, but were part of an ever-growing body of knowledge maintained in temple libraries, where younger apprentices learned by copying older works, ensuring the survival of both the skill and the tradition. Through their discipline, the Tonalpukwe served as the quiet architects of the empire's rhythm, unseen by many yet essential to the life of the Aztec world, their work stretching beyond the present moment into the deep past and the imagined future, as steady and cyclical as the turning of the heavens they so patiently observed. Within the bustling heart of Tenochtitlan, the presence of the calendar makers was felt not only in the grand ceremonies of the state, but also in the daily routines of ordinary people, for the structuring of time affected every layer of society. Market days, religious fasts, planting and harvesting schedules, and even the timing of journeys between distant towns were influenced by the cycles they kept. In the great market of Tlatelolco, traders arriving from all corners of the empire often timed their visits according to auspicious days identified by the Tonalpohualli, believing that to set out under a favorable sign would increase their chances of success. Farmers working the chinampas, the fertile floating gardens that spread out like green quilts over the shallows of the lake, relied on the Xiuhpohualli to tell them when to begin turning the soil, when to sow maize, beans, and squash, and when to prepare for the rainy season. These rhythms were as much a part of life as the rising and setting of the sun, and the calendar makers ensured that they remained accurate and aligned with the natural world. Observations were carried out at carefully chosen points throughout the city, from the heights of the Templo Mayor to smaller temples aligned with sunrise on particular dates, each serving as a fixed point in the year's cycle. In the pre-dawn stillness, a Tonalpuki might stand on a stone platform, eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, waiting for the first glint of light to crest a distant peak. The moment it appeared, he would note its position against the carved markers embedded in the temple's architecture, an alignment planned generations earlier by builders who understood the importance of linking stone to sky. The codices that recorded these observations were works of both science and art, their pages filled with bright pigments that conveyed meaning not only through the shapes of glyphs, but also through the colors themselves, deep reds, yellows, and blues, each carrying a symbolic weight. Apprentices learned to mix these pigments from ground minerals, plants, and insects, preparing them in small bowls and applying them with brushes made from animal hair. The creation of a codex was a slow and deliberate process, requiring as much care as the observations themselves, for these books were intended to last for generations and to be read by eyes not yet born. In this way, the work of the Tonalpukwe extended far beyond the present moment, becoming part of the long memory of the Aztec world. They saw themselves as stewards of a cosmic order, responsible not only for keeping time, but for ensuring that the empire's actions remained in harmony with the sacred cycles that governed the universe. Even the most ordinary tasks, lighting a household fire, beginning a journey, planting a seed, were understood as threads in this vast pattern, and the calendar maker's role was to keep those threads aligned. In the quiet intervals between their duties, some would reflect on the enormity of their task, knowing that the turning of the heavens was indifferent to human concerns, yet also understanding that the patterns they recorded were the framework within which life in Tenochtitlan unfolded. This sense of connection between the movements of the sky and the pulse of daily life gave their work a quiet dignity, one that endured even as the empire faced the challenges and changes that history would inevitably bring. The knowledge held by the Tonalpukwe was the product of centuries of refinement, inherited not only from their own predecessors, but from older Mesoamerican traditions that stretched far back in time. The Aztecs were not the first to develop sophisticated calendars. They built upon foundations laid by the Maya and other cultures, adapting the systems to their own environment and worldview. The result was a precise, interlocking structure of timekeeping that could track both the agricultural cycle and the sacred cycle, each with its own logic, yet bound together in the larger cosmic order. The Shupahuali, with its 365 days, mirrored the solar year, guiding the planting and harvesting that fed the empire. The Tonalpohuali, with its 260 days, was tied to ritual life, divination, and the naming of days for births and important events. Every 52 years, the two calendars aligned perfectly, marking the completion of a century in Aztec reckoning and initiating the new fire ceremony, a night of extinguished flames and anxious waiting for the renewal of the world. For the calendar makers, these convergences were moments of immense significance, opportunities to demonstrate the precision of their work and to affirm the continuity of the cycles they kept. In the years between such great events, their daily routines were quieter but no less important. They observed the sun's position at solstices and equinoxes, noting how its path shifted along the horizon and how its midday height changed with the seasons. They tracked the moon's phases and the intervals between eclipses, carefully recording the rare moments when the sun and moon aligned in the sky. They watched Venus with special attention, charting its appearances as the morning star and evening star, for its cycle of disappearance and return was deeply woven into Aztec mythology. All these observations were committed to codices, painted in careful strokes with pigments mixed from cochineal insects for red, indigo plants for blue, and ground minerals for yellow and green. The codices were stored in the calm interior rooms of temples, away from the heat and moisture, guarded as treasures of the state. Apprentices learned by copying the older works, committing to memory the sequences of day signs and numbers, the symbols for months, and the patterns of movement in the sky. This training could take years, for it required not only an eye for detail, but also the ability to interpret the meaning of the cycles and to communicate that meaning to others. In public life, the Tonalpohuali were often consulted before important undertakings, their pronouncements shaping decisions from marriage dates to trade expeditions to military campaigns. The people of the empire lived within the framework these men maintained, trusting that by keeping time in harmony with the cosmos, they were ensuring prosperity and balance. And so, night after night, from the heights of temples or the open courtyards of observatories, the calendar makers continued their vigil, marking the passage of time. Not as a straight line, but as a great wheel turning endlessly, each spoke connecting the present moment to the deep past and the unseen future. In the quieter hours of the Aztec capital, when the canals reflected the soft light of the moon and the distant hum of the markets had faded into silence, the Tonalpohuali often carried out some of their most careful observations. These moments of stillness allowed them to focus on the precise alignments that marked the passage of seasons and the shifting balance between day and night. They knew that the sun did not rise and set in the same place every day, but instead moved gradually along the horizon, reaching its furthest point north or south at the solstices before reversing direction. Such movements were not merely of academic interest. They signaled the approach of planting or harvest, the timing of festivals, and the transitions between wet and dry seasons. From high terraces and temple steps, the calendar makers used natural features of the landscape, such as distant mountain peaks or gaps in the hills, as fixed markers against which to measure the sun's path. At dawn, they would watch intently as the first rays broke the horizon, comparing the sun's position to carvings or stones embedded in the temple walls that had been set in place generations earlier for this exact purpose. At night, they shifted their attention to the moon and the wandering planets, noting the times of moonrise and moonset, the changing shape of the lunar disk, and the long cycles of Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. Venus, in particular, held a special place in Aztec cosmology, for its cycle of disappearance and reappearance was tied to myths of death, rebirth, and the movements of the gods. When Venus first appeared as the morning star after a period of absence, it often coincided with important rituals, and the Tonalpohuali took great care to predict and confirm its return. Their work required not only skill but patience, for many of these cycles unfolded slowly, over months or years, and a complete understanding could only be gained by comparing observations across decades. The codices in which they recorded these findings were treated with reverence, wrapped in cloth, and stored in dry, cool rooms within temple complexes, Apprentices were taught to handle them with care, for these books were more than tools. They were the memory of the empire, a bridge between past and future. In their painted pages, rows of glyphs and symbols mapped the flow of time, each sign representing a day, a god, or a celestial event, all bound together in a web of meaning. The calendar makers understood that the cycles they tracked were larger than themselves, and that their role was not to change or control them, but to ensure that the human world remained aligned with the cosmic order. It was this alignment that the Aztecs believed would keep their society prosperous and harmonious, protecting them from chaos and misfortune. And so, under the same stars their ancestors had watched, the Tonalpuke kept their steady vigil, marking each dawn and dusk as another step in the endless turning of the great wheel of time. As the seasons turned and the great city of Tenochtitlan moved through the cycles of planting, harvesting, and celebration, the work of the Tonalpuke continued with the same deliberate pace it had kept for generations. By now, their role was so deeply woven into the functioning of the empire that few aspects of life occurred without reference to their calculations. Merchants arranging long trading journeys into distant provinces consulted them for the most favorable departure dates. Builders designing new temples or public works aligned their structures according to celestial markers identified by the calendars. Even the training of warriors and the preparation for military campaigns often followed the rhythm of auspicious and inauspicious days recorded in the codices. The Tonalpuke themselves lived lives of discipline and study, often beginning their apprenticeships in youth, learning first to recognize the 20-day signs of the Tonalpohualli and the 18 months of the Xiuhpohualli, then gradually mastering the intricate interlocking of the two systems. Their days were filled with observation, record-keeping, and teaching as they trained the next generation to carry on the work. In the quiet hours before dawn, they might be found high on temple platforms, watching for the exact moment when the Pleiades reached its highest point in the night sky, a marker of great importance in the larger cycles of time. At sunset, they would note the changing position of the sun against the distant mountain ranges, its slow drift along the horizon, forming a silent calendar only the trained eye could read. In their codices, they painted not only the sequences of days and months, but also images of gods, animals, and natural forces associated with each period, for the Aztec understanding of time was inseparable from its spiritual dimensions. Each day carried its own character, shaped by the deities and cosmic forces linked to it, and it was the task of the calendar makers to interpret this character for those who sought guidance. Their interpretations could influence matters of state and personal life alike, from the scheduling of coronations to the naming of children. The codices themselves were treasured objects, often passed down within temple schools for centuries, their pigments retaining their brightness thanks to careful preparation and storage. The Tonalpuque took pride in this preservation, knowing that the knowledge they safeguarded might outlast their own city. And though their work was tied to cycles that repeated endlessly, they never considered it monotonous, for each turn of the calendar brought subtle variations, new alignments, and fresh opportunities to align human action with the cosmic order. In this way, the calendar makers of the Aztec Empire continued their unbroken watch, guiding the life of the city through the measured heartbeat of the heavens, their painted records a living bridge between earth and sky. In the later years of the Aztec Empire, when Tenochtitlan had reached the height of its splendor with canals gleaming under the sun and markets overflowing with goods from every corner of the realm, the Tonalpuque worked quietly behind the scenes, their influence woven into the city's very rhythm. By then, their codices contained decades of carefully painted records, each page a map of days and cycles, each glyph carrying the weight of accumulated meaning. These books were not meant to be read in haste. They were studied slowly, their symbols unfolding their significance only to those who had been trained to understand them. In the stillness of temple rooms lit by flickering torches, the calendar makers would sit in small groups, reviewing past records to compare them with recent observations, ensuring that no subtle shift in the heavens had gone unnoticed. They paid particular attention to the movements of Venus, whose cycle of disappearance and reappearance was timed with precision, for its transitions between morning star and evening star were linked to myths of death, rebirth, and the journeys of the gods. The position of Venus could influence the timing of ceremonies, declarations of war, or the dedication of temples, and so it was tracked with almost obsessive care. The sun's solstices and equinoxes were also marked with great accuracy, for these moments define the turning points of the year. At the summer solstice, when the sun rose at its northernmost point, the Tonalpuke would note its alignment with specific architectural features, some of which had been built generations earlier for this exact purpose. Similarly, at the equinoxes, the sun's path would balance between north and south, a moment of symmetry that carried deep symbolic significance. Their work extended beyond astronomy into the realm of guidance and interpretation. Families came to them for advice on when to hold naming ceremonies for newborns. Merchants asked for the best days to begin journeys, and leaders sought assurance that their plans would align with the sacred patterns. The Tonalpuke understood that their authority rested not only on accuracy, but on trust, and so they maintained strict discipline in their work, avoiding any error that could cast doubt on their counsel. In public festivals, they sometimes appeared alongside priests, their presence a reminder that the celebration was not just an earthly affair, but a reflection of celestial order. Yet despite their importance, the Tonalpuke were not figures of spectacle. They preferred the quiet of observation, the slow turning of pages, and the patient watching of the sky. In their minds, the grandeur of Tenochtitlan was temporary, but the movements of the heavens were eternal, and their task was to keep the two in harmony for as long as the city endured. And so, night after night, they climbed the temple steps, looked to the horizons, and recorded in their codices the measured heartbeat of the universe, confident that their work would guide the empire as surely as the stars guided their own gaze. As the cycles of the heavens continued their endless turn, the Tonalpuque worked on with a constancy that mirrored the very stars they observed, their lives defined by the rhythm of celestial events rather than by the shifting fortunes of politics or war. They knew that empires could rise and fall in the space of a few generations, but the path of the sun across the horizon, the phases of the moon, and the returning brilliance of Venus would remain unchanged for centuries. This awareness gave their work a sense of permanence, a connection to something far older and more enduring than the walls and markets of Tenochtitlan. They recorded their observations with a discipline born of tradition, each mark in the codex representing not just a moment in time, but a link in a chain stretching back through generations of watchers. On certain nights, when the air was clear and still, they would watch for rare events: a lunar eclipse casting the moon into a deep copper hue, a comet flaring briefly across the darkness, or the sudden brightening of a star. These events were entered into the records with care, accompanied by notes on their timing, position, and possible meaning within the cycles of the calendars. Though the Aztec understanding of astronomy was deeply spiritual, the Tonalpuque approached their work with a precision that reflected a practical understanding of the sky's mechanics. They knew that predicting the return of a star to a certain position or the reappearance of Venus after its absence required not divine intervention, but careful observation and calculation. And yet, for them, the sacred and the scientific were not separate. Both were part of a single truth in which the movements of the heavens and the affairs of the earth were intertwined. Their codices held not only charts of days and months, but also vivid illustrations of gods and cosmic symbols, making each book a blend of record-keeping and sacred art. In these painted pages, the story of time itself unfolded in a language of glyphs and colors, one that could be read only by those trained in its complexities. The Tonalpuque guarded these books carefully, knowing they were among the most precious treasures of the empire, not for their material value, but for the knowledge they contained. Even as they worked, they were aware that they were part of a lineage, and that one day their own observations would be read by future calendar keepers, who would continue the task long after they were gone. In this way, their lives were woven into the larger fabric of time they measured. Each day they recorded another stitch in the endless pattern of the cosmos. And so, while the city below them bustled with trade, music, and ceremony, the Tonalpuque kept their silent watch, patient and unhurried, knowing that the sky above would always turn, and that their duty was to turn with it, marking each step in the eternal dance between earth and heaven. In the final years before the great upheavals that would forever change the Aztec world, the Tonalpuque continued their work as they always had, unaware that their centuries-old tradition was approaching its last uninterrupted cycle. The city of Tenochtitlan still shone brightly in the heart of the lake, its temples rising above canals and causeways, its markets alive with the voices of traders, and its festivals marked with the careful timing set by the calendars. On the high platforms of temples, the calendar makers stood in the cool air of dawn, their eyes fixed on the horizon, noting the precise moment when the first sliver of the sun appeared. They recorded the positions of stars, the turning of the moon, the return of Venus as morning star, and the alignment of the sun with sacred architecture at solstices and equinoxes. Their codices, carefully painted with symbols, colors, and glyphs, held the complete record of their observations, preserving a map of time that reached backward into memory and forward into the imagined future. They understood that their work was more than a record. It was the guiding framework for the empire's spiritual and practical life. Births were named according to the Tono Pohwali, fields were sown and harvested by the Chu Pohwali, and great ceremonies like the New Fire were timed with astronomical precision, all to keep the human world in harmony with the cosmic order. The Tono Puke knew that to disrupt this balance was to invite chaos, for the cycles of the heavens were the foundation of all stability. Yet they also understood their own place within these cycles, recognizing that they were but one link in a chain of countless calendar makers before them, and that others would one day take their place. When the great binding of the years approached, anticipation built throughout the city, and the Tonalpuke worked with unwavering focus to ensure that the transition into the next cycle would be marked without error. As the appointed night came, fires across the city were extinguished, and the people waited in silence while the watchers observed the stars. When the Pleiades reached its zenith, a new fire was lit, and its flames spread through the streets, rekindling the life of the city and marking the continuation of the world. For another 52 years, this ceremony, more than any other, embodied the purpose of the calendar makers, to stand at the point where the cycles of the cosmos and the lives of people met, ensuring that the two moved together in harmony. But history would soon turn, and the arrival of foreign conquerors would disrupt the continuity that had held for centuries. Even so, the records they left, the painted codices, the architectural alignments, the oral teachings passed to apprentices, would endure as a testament to their skill and devotion. Today, fragments of their work survive in museums and archives, their colors faded but their meaning still resonating, offering us a glimpse into a world where time was not a line, but a great wheel, turning endlessly, guided by the careful hands and watchful eyes of the Tonalpuke, the calendar makers of the Aztec Empire. That concludes our previous story. Before we move on to the next one, I'd be grateful if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's continue our journey through the Boring History for Sleep series and begin our next story, how Al-Khwarizmi calculated without fanfare. Many centuries ago, in the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, there lived a man whose name would one day echo quietly through the halls of mathematics, astronomy, and science, though in his own time he worked without the clamor of fame or public recognition. This man was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, born in the distant lands near the ancient city of Khwarizm, in what is now Uzbekistan, and brought to the great city of Baghdad, where he would spend much of his life in the House of Wisdom. Baghdad in the 9th century was a city of learning, its streets filled with merchants, scholars, and travelers from across the known world, and at its center stood this great institution, a library and academy where the brightest minds gathered to translate, preserve, and expand upon the knowledge of many civilizations. Al-Khwarizmi's work here was deliberate and meticulous, concerned not with grand displays, but with the careful ordering of ideas, the slow turning of problems in the mind until they revealed their structure. Among his most enduring contributions was his systematic treatment of solving equations, a method he described in his book, Kitab al-Jabr wal Muqabala, a title that would one day give rise to the very word algebra. In this text, he laid out step by step how to reduce and balance equations, to bring terms from one side to the other, and to simplify them in a way that could be taught, remembered, and applied to practical problems. His approach was clear and orderly, designed to be understood by those who might never think of themselves as mathematicians, but who needed these tools for commerce, land measurement, and inheritance laws. Beyond algebra, Al-Khwarizmi worked on refining astronomical tables, drawing from Greek, Indian, and Persian sources, but adapting them for the needs of his time. He calculated the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, provided methods for determining the times of prayer and the direction of Mecca, and even worked on a revised world map, placing cities, rivers, and mountains in their proper places. His calculations were careful and precise, and while they lacked the flourish of public spectacle, they carried the quiet authority of accuracy. He did not seek to make himself a figure of legend. His aim was to make knowledge usable, to transform scattered ideas into clear, repeatable methods. In his own era, such work was valued more for its utility than for personal glory, and so he labored without the applause of the crowds, his name known mainly among scholars. Yet in this quiet persistence lay a strength, for the systems he described became part of the foundation upon which later generations would build. His algorithms, the step-by-step procedures for solving problems, would one day lend their name to the very concept of an algorithm, a term now central to the world of computing. But in the 9th century, these methods were not abstract theories. They were tools for daily life, guiding merchants in their accounts, surveyors in their measurements, and judges in their rulings. And so, in the cool, shaded rooms of the House of Wisdom, surrounded by scrolls and manuscripts, Al-Khwarizmi continued his careful work, his mind moving steadily from one calculation to the next, the ink drying slowly on the pages that would carry his ideas far beyond the world he knew, across centuries and continents, to shape the way countless others would think, count, and measure. In the quiet corridors of the House of Wisdom, Al-Khwarizmi's days unfolded with a steady rhythm, each one devoted to the careful examination of numbers, the translation of ideas, and the refinement of methods that could be used by scholars and ordinary people alike. The building itself was a marvel of its time, a place where Arabic, Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac manuscripts rested side by side, where scribes moved silently between rows of shelves carrying bundles of scrolls, and where the faint scent of ink and parchment lingered in the air. Here, Al-Khwarizmi often worked at a low wooden desk, surrounded by reference texts and notes, cross-checking a value from an Indian astronomical table with a Greek calculation, then adjusting it to suit the latitude of Baghdad. He did not hurry, for precision was his guiding principle, and he knew that the smallest miscalculation could spread through a table or a method, rendering it useless. His work on the Zij, or astronomical tables, was particularly meticulous, involving the computation of planetary positions, the prediction of eclipses, and the calibration of instruments used for observation. Each entry in these tables had to be both accurate and accessible, so that a muezzin could determine the correct times for the 5 daily prayers, or a traveler could find the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, from anywhere in the empire. Beyond astronomy, Al-Khwarizmi was deeply interested in geography, and at the request of the Caliph, he undertook the task of revising and expanding Ptolemy's geography. This was no simple copying of old maps. It was a remeasuring of the known world, correcting distances, updating the coordinates of cities, and adding places that had been unknown to the Greeks. For this, he relied not only on older sources, but also on reports from merchants, sailors, and travelers who passed through Baghdad, each carrying pieces of information from distant lands. He compiled these into a coherent map and a list of coordinates, allowing others to navigate with greater confidence. His mind worked in layers, able to shift from the abstract elegance of algebraic reasoning to the practical demands of determining the width of a river or the area of a field. Yet in all this, he avoided self-promotion, content to let the value of his work speak through its usefulness. He was known among his peers as methodical, patient, and exacting, a man who would rather delay completion than release something flawed. In an age when many sought to impress with elaborate displays or poetic embellishments, Al-Khwarizmi preferred clarity, ensuring that anyone with basic learning could follow his reasoning. The style of his writings reflected this, concise but complete, structured so that each step followed logically from the one before, like stones laid in a straight path. And though he could not have foreseen it, this approach would make his works resilient, surviving not only the passage of time, but the translation into many languages, their logic intact even when their words were recast. In this way, his life in the House of Wisdom was a quiet one, filled with the unhurried labor of thought, his calculations flowing from one day to the next. As steady as the arc of the sun, he tracked across the sky, each figure a small but essential part of the greater pattern he sought to understand. Al-Khwarizmi's approach to problem-solving was shaped by a belief that mathematics was not an abstract pursuit detached from life, but a practical language through which the world could be understood, measured, and improved. In his time, many of the problems he addressed were not posed by fellow mathematicians, but by merchants, judges, architects, and surveyors, people whose work required accurate calculations for contracts, trade, construction, and inheritance. In the bustling city of Baghdad, where goods from India, China, Africa, and Europe passed through its markets, a merchant might need to divide profits among partners according to complicated agreements, or a judge might be tasked with determining a fair division of an estate under Islamic inheritance law, where shares were fixed according to a precise formula. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra offered a systematic method for such cases, moving step by step from the problem statement to its resolution without ambiguity. His book on algebra began with simple equations and progressed to more complex ones, guiding the reader through the process of algebra, restoring, and al-muqabala, balancing, terms that describe the rearrangement and simplification of equations. This clarity made his work widely usable, and it spread far beyond Baghdad, eventually influencing European mathematics when it was translated into Latin centuries later. But in his own day, the spread of knowledge was not through printed books, but through painstakingly copied manuscripts, each letter drawn by hand, each diagram measured carefully. Al-Khwarizmi worked closely with scribes to ensure that his instructions were recorded without error, for he knew that a single misplaced symbol could confuse a reader far from Baghdad, who might never meet the author. He also contributed to the understanding of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, explaining its advantages over older counting methods and showing how calculations could be done more quickly and with fewer mistakes. This too was a quiet revolution, for it replaced cumbersome counting tables and abacus methods with written algorithms that could be taught and replicated. His explanation of these methods was not wrapped in mystery. He presented them plainly, with examples that could be followed by anyone willing to learn. In the evenings, when the heat of the day had eased, he would sometimes walk through the city, past the markets and gardens, hearing the calls of traders and the laughter of families gathered in courtyards. To most people, he was just another scholar from the House of Wisdom, a man in simple robes carrying a scroll or a wax tablet, unremarkable among the many learned figures of Baghdad. Yet in the quiet of his study, by the glow of an oil lamp, he continued to shape ideas that would endure long after those streets had changed. He was not driven by the desire to see his name remembered, but by the satisfaction of a problem solved with elegance and clarity, knowing that each solution added a small but lasting order to the vast complexity of the world. And so, with steady hands and a mind attuned to patterns, Al-Khwarizmi calculated without fanfare, his legacy growing silently, carried forward by the very methods he had crafted to make calculation clear, reliable, and universal. In the House of Wisdom, where the warm air was filled with the faint scent of ink, parchment, and polished wood, Al-Khwarizmi often sat surrounded by the quiet hum of scholarly work, the scratch of reed pens on paper, and the murmured exchanges between translators, comparing Greek, Sanskrit, and Arabic texts. His contributions were not made in isolation. He was part of a larger movement of knowledge, a bridge between civilizations, gathering the fragments of earlier discoveries and arranging them into coherent systems that could be taught, remembered, and used. One of his lesser-known but significant efforts was his refinement of the astrolabe, a device used for determining the positions of stars and planets, measuring time, and aiding navigation. Al-Khwarizmi wrote treatises on its construction and use, explaining how to calculate the altitude of celestial bodies and how to apply these measurements to practical needs, such as determining prayer times or finding the direction of Mecca. His instructions were methodical and unadorned, designed not to impress with flourish, but to ensure that anyone with patience and a basic education could follow them. This same practical clarity marked his work in trigonometry, where he introduced tables of sines and tangents adapted from Indian sources, but organized in a way that made them accessible to scholars of the Islamic world. These tables allowed astronomers to calculate distances and angles with greater ease, which in turn improved the accuracy of astronomical observations and geographic measurements. In geography, his revisions to Ptolemy's work went beyond correcting errors. He sought to make maps more reflective of actual experience, incorporating data from travelers and merchants who had seen lands far beyond the Roman world. He adjusted coastlines, repositioned rivers, and added towns that had never before appeared in formal geographic works. To him, the map was not just an image, but a mathematical model of the world, a representation that could guide trade, administration, and exploration. Despite the breadth of his knowledge, Al-Khwarizmi remained focused on the task at hand, preferring to work through each problem patiently rather than seeking recognition for the scale of his accomplishments. His name was known among the scholars of Baghdad and beyond, but always as a man of dependable precision rather than as a figure of grand public fame. In the evenings, when the day's work in the House of Wisdom was done, he might take a slow walk through its courtyard gardens, where the sound of running water from fountains mingled with the rustling of palm leaves in the breeze. There, under the shifting light of the stars he had charted, he could reflect on the patterns of the heavens and the patterns of numbers, both governed by laws that were constant and harmonious. The city around him was vibrant and changing, but the principles he studied were timeless, waiting quietly for those willing to seek them out. And so, in his measured way, Al-Khwarizmi continued to calculate, to organize, and to refine, leaving behind works whose influence would cross continents and centuries, carried forward not by his voice, but by the enduring clarity of his methods, still echoing in the algorithms, maps, and astronomical tables of the world today. As his reputation grew quietly among scholars, Al-Khwarizmi's works began to travel far beyond the walls of the House of Wisdom, carried by traders, diplomats, and students who brought copies of his manuscripts to other centers of learning across the Islamic world. His treatise on algebra, written in clear and practical language, found its way to North Africa, Andalusia, and eventually into the libraries of medieval Europe, where it would be translated into Latin under the title Algoritmi de Numero Indorum, introducing not only his methods, but his very name to the Latin-speaking world. Over time, algorithmi evolved into the modern word algorithm, a term now central to mathematics and computing. Yet in his own life, Al-Khwarizmi would not have seen this transformation, for his work was meant simply to be useful, to solve the problems faced by administrators calculating taxes, surveyors measuring land, and merchants dividing goods. He was careful to present each method in steps that could be followed without ambiguity, beginning with a clear statement of the problem, moving through each operation in sequence, and concluding with the answer in its simplest form. This structured thinking reflected his belief that knowledge should be a tool for all who needed it, not a guarded secret of a scholarly elite. In astronomy, his tables of planetary positions and solar movements were designed for accuracy and practicality, helping sailors navigate by the stars and enabling religious scholars to determine prayer times with confidence. His geographic work, too, had a tangible impact, giving travelers and mapmakers a more accurate sense of distances and locations. All of this he accomplished without seeking the status of a court celebrity or the rewards of political favor. He preferred the steady companionship of his fellow scholars, the quiet discipline of the study room, and the unbroken focus of a mind at work. In the evenings, as the city of Baghdad cooled and the sounds of the markets faded, he might pause at the threshold of the House of Wisdom, looking up at the clear night sky. The constellations were not for him objects of myth alone, but reference points, fixed markers in a vast and ordered system that could be understood, measured, and described. He knew that just as the stars traced their predictable paths across the heavens, so too could numbers be guided through a problem to arrive at a solution. The satisfaction of this certainty was reward enough, and it sustained him through years of patient labor. His legacy, though still unfolding, was already taking root, for those who read his works found in them not only knowledge, but a method of thinking, logical, clear, and adaptable, that could be applied to problems far beyond those he had envisioned. And so, without fanfare, without monuments or public acclaim, Al-Khwarizmi continued his life's work, each calculation, each careful line of script, a quiet step in a journey that would carry his ideas across centuries, shaping the very language and tools of mathematics for generations yet to come. In the later years of his career, Al-Khwarizmi's role in the House of Wisdom remained as constant and deliberate as the patterns he studied, for his work was never bound to a single subject, but stretched across mathematics, astronomy, geography, and even the practical sciences of measurement and timekeeping. By then, he had become a senior figure in the scholarly community, guiding younger students through the discipline of clear reasoning, showing them how to break down a complex problem into its parts and solve it step by step. He often reminded them that numbers, like the stars, followed rules that could be learned and relied upon, but only if one worked with patience and precision. His explanations were never rushed. When teaching, he preferred to begin with a simple example, ensuring that the principle was understood before moving to more complicated cases. The same careful pacing was evident in his writings, where each section built logically on the one before, allowing a reader to follow his thought without becoming lost. Beyond teaching, he continued to refine his astronomical tables, incorporating new observations into the data so that predictions of planetary positions, eclipses, and solar movements remained accurate for the needs of navigators, religious scholars, and administrators. His updates to geographic works also continued, with fresh information gathered from travelers arriving in Baghdad, details of a river's true course, the precise location of a port, or the corrected distance between two cities. In his quiet way, he was helping to keep the empire's understanding of the world both accurate and up to date. But perhaps his most enduring gift to those who studied with him was the habit of approaching every problem as if it deserved his full attention, no matter how small. He treated a simple equation for dividing grain among merchants with the same respect as a complex astronomical calculation for both required accuracy and clear reasoning. In the evenings, when his formal work was done, he might remain in the House of Wisdom long after most had gone, reviewing a manuscript by lamplight or checking a set of figures once more before committing them to a final copy. The courtyard outside would be quiet, the sound of the city softened by distance, and above, the stars he had charted would turn slowly in the night sky. For Al-Khwarizmi, this was the natural order of things, a world in which patience and precision brought understanding, where every correct calculation was a small act of harmony with the greater patterns of the universe. And though he never sought to place himself at the center of attention, his influence was quietly spreading, carried by the clarity of his methods and the reliability of his results, so that even as the seasons changed and generations passed, his work would remain a touchstone for those who valued the art of thinking clearly and calculating well. As the seasons passed in Baghdad, the steady hum of activity in the House of Wisdom continued, and Al-Khwarizmi remained at his desk, pursuing the work that had defined his life. By now, he was a familiar figure among the scholars, moving quietly through the halls lined with shelves of manuscripts. His presence marked less by grand speeches than by the consistency of his efforts. He had long since mastered the art of turning complex ideas into clear, teachable methods, and this skill made his writings valuable to both his contemporaries and the generations that would follow. His treatise on arithmetic, in which he explained the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, was especially influential, for it replaced cumbersome Roman numerals and older counting systems with symbols that could be combined in endless ways to represent any number. By teaching people to calculate using place value and zero, he gave them a tool that made arithmetic faster, more accurate, and more accessible. Traders could now keep more precise accounts, architects could make more reliable measurements, and administrators could calculate taxes and distribute resources with greater efficiency. He also refined methods for calculating areas, volumes, and proportions, showing how these could be applied in everything from land division to construction projects. In astronomy, his Zid tables were continually updated and circulated, their reliability making them standard references across much of the Islamic world. His work in geography likewise remained in use, with his corrected coordinates guiding travelers and informing maps for decades after they were first compiled. Yet for all the breadth of his achievements, Al-Khwarizmi's life retained its quiet rhythm, mornings spent reviewing calculations, afternoons devoted to writing or teaching, evenings perhaps given to conversation with fellow scholars over cups of warm drink, and nights under the open courtyard sky, where the stars were both his companions and his reference points. He carried himself without arrogance, speaking with the same patience to an eager young student as he would to a senior colleague. His focus was never on self-promotion, but on ensuring that the knowledge he passed on was correct, complete, and useful. And so, day after day, year after year, he worked without fanfare, confident that the value of his efforts lay not in immediate praise, but in the enduring clarity and utility of the methods he had shaped. In time, this very modesty became part of his legacy, a reminder that great changes in human understanding often come not from those who seek the spotlight, but from those who, like Al-Khwarizmi, are content to labor quietly, turning ideas into tools and leaving behind work so sound that it needs no further defense. By the later period of his life, Al-Khwarizmi had become a quiet cornerstone of the scholarly world in Baghdad, a man whose name was spoken with respect in circles of learning, yet still unknown to the wider public, who benefited from his work without ever realizing it. The House of Wisdom remained his primary place of labor, a hub where mathematicians, astronomers, translators, and geographers came together to share knowledge gathered from across the known world. Al-Khwarizmi's desk was often covered in neatly stacked manuscripts, some in his own hand, others copied by skilled scribes, each holding calculations, diagrams, and careful notes. His mind moved with ease between subjects, solving algebraic equations in the morning, correcting geographic coordinates in the afternoon, and reviewing astronomical observations at night. He remained deeply engaged in the refinement of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, continuing to promote its efficiency in trade, administration, and science. To him, the ability to perform calculations quickly and accurately was not merely a scholarly exercise, but a vital skill for a functioning society, and he worked tirelessly to ensure that these methods were understood and adopted widely. In astronomy, his meticulous Zij tables became trusted guides for determining prayer times, tracking celestial movements, and aiding navigation, and they were copied and used as far away as Spain and Central Asia. His geographic work still found practical application in travel and cartography, offering a more accurate sense of distance and location than most maps of the time. Despite his far-reaching influence, Al-Khwarizmi never sought to embellish his achievements. His writing remained focused on clarity, avoiding the temptation to impress with the unnecessary complexity. He preferred his work to speak for itself, confident that its precision and usefulness would secure its place in the hands of future generations. Evenings in Baghdad often found him in the courtyard of the House of Wisdom, where the scent of blooming plants mingled with the sound of water trickling from fountains, the lamps casting a warm glow on the colonnades. There, under the same stars he had measured and charted, he might speak quietly with fellow scholars about the day's work, or simply sit in contemplation, tracing in his mind the patterns of numbers and celestial bodies that had occupied his thoughts for decades. His life was an exercise in constancy, never rushed, never careless, always guided by the belief that knowledge should be ordered, accessible, and enduring. In this way, he became not only a mathematician and astronomer, but also a custodian of human understanding, ensuring that what had been discovered would not be lost, and that what had been refined would remain clear for those who came after him. As the years went by, the steady discipline that had defined Al-Khwarizmi's life became even more apparent to those who worked alongside him, for he approached each day with the same measured pace, never rushing and never allowing his attention to drift from the task at hand. In the House of Wisdom, he was known as a man who valued order in all things, from the arrangement of his manuscripts to the structure of his reasoning. His workspace was always meticulously kept, scrolls neatly rolled, codices aligned on low wooden shelves, and his writing tools arranged so that no movement was wasted when he worked. Each morning he would begin with a review of the previous day's calculations, checking them for errors before moving on to new problems. These might range from determining the optimal method for solving a particular type of quadratic equation to refining the predicted positions of Jupiter or Saturn for the coming year. His methods in algebra were not just about producing answers. They were about showing others how to think in a structured, logical way so that they could solve problems of their own. His influence on arithmetic was equally important, for he continued to advocate for the Hindu-Arabic numerals, demonstrating their superiority through practical examples that merchants, architects, and administrators could understand. This made his work resonate far beyond scholarly circles, as it directly improved the efficiency of trade, taxation, and engineering across the empire. In astronomy, his Zij tables continued to be refined, and they became so reliable that they were referenced in cities hundreds of miles away by scholars who had never met him. His contributions to geography also remained in demand, with travelers and mapmakers relying on the coordinates he had calculated to plan routes and update charts. Yet for all the reach of his work, he remained largely absent from the public stage, his name known primarily in academic and administrative contexts. In the evenings, as the heat of the day gave way to cooler air, Al-Khwarizmi could often be found in the shaded walkways of the House of Wisdom's courtyard, the the sound of the fountain blending with the distant hum of the city. Above him, the night sky spread out in quiet grandeur, the constellations marking time in their unhurried way, a constant reminder of the order and predictability he so valued. To him, the beauty of his work lay not in its novelty or in personal glory, but in its precision, its clarity, and its ability to endure. And so he continued, year after year, calculating without fanfare, content to know that his efforts were adding stability to the foundations of knowledge, and that the tools he had shaped would remain useful long after his own time had passed. In the final phase of his life, Al-Khwarizmi's work had reached a point where it was no longer confined to the city of Baghdad or the shelves of the House of Wisdom, but had begun to circulate quietly across the vast territories of the Abbasid Caliphate and beyond, carried by traders, scholars, and travelers who valued the clarity and reliability of his methods. Though he never sought recognition beyond his peers, he was aware that his writings were being copied in distant lands, translated into new languages, and adapted for local use. His treatise on algebra had already begun its journey toward becoming a cornerstone of mathematical thought, while his refinements to astronomical tables and geographic coordinates continued to serve practical needs for navigation, timekeeping, and administration. Yet even with this growing influence, Al-Khwarizmi's daily life remained largely unchanged. Early mornings devoted to quiet calculation, long afternoons spent reviewing manuscripts with apprentices, and evenings given to contemplation beneath the slowly turning sky. He often reminded his students that the aim of scholarship was not personal glory, but the preservation and improvement of knowledge, so that it could be passed intact to future generations. His own example made this lesson clear. He had built his life's work on patience, accuracy, and a willingness to revise and refine, rather than rush toward completion. In the House of Wisdom, his presence was a constant, a figure of quiet authority who listened more than he spoke, but whose guidance was sought whenever a complex problem required both insight and method. His writings reflected the same qualities. They were orderly, free of unnecessary ornament, and designed to be understood by anyone willing to follow the steps with care. In this way, they carried his voice forward across time, so that even centuries later, readers who had never heard his name in life could still learn directly from his reasoning. Toward the end, as the city of Baghdad continued its bustling rhythm around him, Al-Khwarizmi might have looked upon his work with a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that the systems he had helped to shape, algebra, algorithms, precise astronomical and geographic methods, would endure beyond his own lifetime. He did not live to see the profound impact his ideas would have on Europe during the later medieval period, nor could he have imagined that his name would one day be tied to the very concept of algorithm in the modern digital world. But perhaps that was fitting, for he had never sought fame, only the enduring usefulness of clear, reliable knowledge. And so his life closed much as it had been lived, without fanfare, without the noise of public celebration, but with the steady confidence that he had added something lasting to the architecture of human understanding. In the stillness of the House of Wisdom's courtyards, under the same stars that had guided his calculations, his legacy remained, quiet, precise, and eternal, like the patterns he had spent a lifetime mapping. That concludes our previous story. Before we move on to the next one, I'd be grateful if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's continue our journey through the Boring History for Sleep series and begin our next story. The Herbalists of Medieval Europe. In the centuries we now call the Middle Ages, long before the rise of modern medicine and the laboratories of the present day, there were men and women in Europe whose lives were devoted to the careful study and use of plants, people known in their time simply as herbalists. They worked quietly in small villages, bustling market towns, and even within the walls of monasteries, their craft shaped by generations of observation and patient trial. Their tools were simple: wooden mortars and pestles for grinding roots, ceramic jars for storing dried leaves, cloth bundles tied with twine to keep herbs in order, and their knowledge was carried not in printed books, but in worn manuscripts, oral traditions, and personal notebooks filled with sketches and notes in faded ink. The herbalist's day often began at first light, when the air was cool and the morning dew still clung to the leaves, for it was believed that some plants held their strongest virtue when gathered at dawn. Moving through fields, forest edges, and garden plots, The herbalist would select chamomile blossoms for calming teas, yarrow for staunching bleeding, and rosemary for its warming effect in winter. In monastery gardens, monks trained in herbal lore cultivated orderly beds of sage, thyme, fennel, and mint. Their rows divided by narrow gravel paths that allowed easy access for tending and harvesting. These gardens were planned with care, placing sun-loving plants along the southern walls and shade-tolerant species under fruit trees or near the shelter of cloisters. In rural cottages, a village herbalist might hang bunches of lavender from the rafters to dry, their scent filling the room, while baskets of freshly dug roots rested near the hearth. The work was not merely about collecting plants. It was about knowing the right season to harvest bark from a willow tree, the precise method of drying marigold petals so they kept their color and potency, and the subtle differences between two similar-looking herbs, one healing and the other harmful. Recipes, or receipts, as they were then called, were passed from teacher to apprentice, often accompanied by prayers or invocations, for the spiritual and the practical were closely intertwined in medieval thought. Illness in those days was explained through a mixture of humoral theory, folk belief, and direct observation, and herbal remedies were matched to balance the humors, hot, cold, wet, and dry, within the body. A cooling herb like plantain might be given for fevers, while warming spices such as cinnamon were prized in winter tonics. Some herbalists traveled, carrying their knowledge from place to place, exchanging seeds and cuttings along with advice. Others stayed rooted in one community, their familiarity with local plants deepening over decades. In both cases, the work required patience and a willingness to learn from experience, for not every remedy succeeded, and plants could change in strength depending on soil, weather, and the skill of preparation. The herbalist craft was one of quiet persistence, each season bringing a new cycle of growth, harvest, and preservation, the shelves of the storeroom gradually filling with jars of dried leaves, bottles of infused oils, and small packets of powdered roots, each labeled in a careful hand, waiting to be called upon when illness came to the door. In the daily life of a medieval herbalist, much of the work took place not in the open fields, but in the quiet of a small workshop or garden shed, where the gathered plants were transformed into medicines, salves, and tonics for the people who came seeking help. The room would often be dim, lit by the filtered light from a small window or the steady glow of a tallow candle, its air thick with the mingled scents of dried herbs, beeswax, vinegar, and honey. On a wooden table worn smooth from years of use, bunches of thyme and sage might be spread to dry, their leaves gently crumbling at the touch, while pestles ground roots of valerian or comfrey into fine powder. Every step of the preparation was done with care, for a poorly dried leaf or an improperly mixed tincture could weaken the remedy or even render it harmful. Glass bottles, when available, were precious and reused many times, cleaned with hot water and sand before being filled again with herbal infusions steeped in wine or ale. In many towns, the herbalist was sought not only for physical ailments, but also for protective charms and remedies against unseen forces. Small bags of rue or fennel seeds hung over doorways to keep away illness, rosemary sprigs placed in homes to purify the air. The knowledge behind these practices was a blend of empirical observation and tradition, informed by works like the Physica of Hildegard of Bingen or translations of ancient texts by Galen and Dioscorides, adapted to suit the plants available in each region. Some herbalists could read Latin and kept copies of illustrated herbals, turning their pages slowly to match the drawings to the plants they knew in the wild, while others relied entirely on memory and the lessons passed down from their elders. In villages, their patients might pay with eggs, bread, or firewood, and in monasteries, their work was part of the broader duty of hospitality, offering healing to travelers and the poor. The changing of the seasons shaped the rhythm of their tasks. Spring was for gathering tender new shoots and flowers, summer for drying and storing leaves, autumn for digging roots and collecting seeds, and winter for blending, measuring, and administering the remedies gathered through the year. Sometimes, an urgent knock would come at night, bringing news of a fevered child or a laboring mother in distress, and the herbalist would rise without hesitation, wrapping a cloak tightly and carrying a pouch of herbs through darkened streets to offer what aid they could. Their work was rarely celebrated, for success often meant nothing more than an illness avoided or a pain eased quietly. But in a time when physicians were few and hospitals scarce, the herbalist was an essential presence, bridging the gap between nature's offerings and the needs of the human body, guided by a deep respect for the plants that sustained their craft. Beyond their daily work of preparing remedies, medieval herbalists were also careful record keepers, chronicling their observations of plants, seasons, and treatments in ways that could be shared with apprentices or preserved for future generations. In monasteries, these records were often bound into illuminated manuscripts, with each plant carefully drawn in colored ink, its leaves, flowers, and roots depicted in detail, so it could be recognized by those who had never seen it in the wild. Next to these images, neat lines of script described the plant's properties, where it grew best, and the methods by which it should be harvested and prepared. In rural communities, where formal writing was less common, herbalists sometimes carved simple marks on wooden boards or kept mental tallies of which herbs were in store, relying on their memory to recall recipes perfected over many seasons. They might note that elderflower gathered on a sunny morning made a better cordial than that gathered on a damp day, or that marjoram grown in dry soil carried a stronger scent than when raised in shaded gardens. They knew that a plant's virtues could change subtly depending on the time of year, the condition of the soil, and even the phase of the moon when it was picked. In towns, herbalists sometimes formed loose networks, meeting at fairs or market days to exchange seeds, cuttings, and knowledge. These gatherings allowed them to learn about plants from distant regions, perhaps a healing root brought north from the Mediterranean, or a fragrant spice arriving along the trade routes from the east. Some of these newcomers were quickly embraced into the herbal tradition, while others were treated with caution until their effects were better understood. The herbalist's learning was never static. It was built layer by layer, a living craft that blended inherited wisdom with direct experience. There was also a moral dimension to their work, for many herbalists saw themselves as caretakers of both the land and the people. They harvested with restraint, taking only what was needed so that the plants could regrow, and they often offered their services to the sick regardless of their ability to pay. Though their work lacked the prestige of university-trained physicians, it was rooted in a profound familiarity with the living world, a knowledge that could mean the difference between recovery and decline. And so, in the quiet hours of the day, whether copying a passage into a worn notebook, sorting jars in a storeroom, or exchanging stories with a fellow herbalist in the shade of a market stall, these practitioners were preserving a tradition that had endured for centuries, carrying it forward through times of change and uncertainty, one patient, one plant, and one careful observation at a time. As the seasons turned and the medieval landscape shifted from the green flush of spring to the golden tones of autumn, the rhythm of the herbalist's work followed the same steady cycle, guided by the growth and dormancy of the plants they tended. In the warm months, their baskets were filled with fresh leaves of sage, mint, and parsley, blossoms of chamomile and calendula, and stems of meadowsweet gathered from the edges of streams. Each harvest was carefully timed, for an herb gathered too early might lack its full potency, while one taken too late could lose its fragrance or strength. Once brought indoors, the plants were spread on woven mats or hung in bunches from the beams of low-ceilinged workrooms, where the air was kept dry and shaded from direct sunlight to preserve their color and medicinal properties. Roots such as angelica, burdock, and valerian were dug in autumn, when the plant's energy had retreated underground, concentrating its virtue in the thick, knotted taproot. These were washed in cool water, sliced thin with small iron knives, and laid out to dry slowly before being stored in clay jars. The work required patience and an understanding that every plant had its own temperament. Some demanded quick processing before they wilted, while others improved after a period of drying or fermentation. Alongside this practical knowledge was a layer of belief shaped by the times, for medieval herbalists often worked within the framework of the doctrine of signatures, which taught that the shape, color, or habitat of a plant hinted at its healing purpose: a yellow flower for ailments of the liver, a heart-shaped leaf for the heart, a root resembling a limb for joint pain. Whether taken as symbolic truth or useful mnemonic, these associations helped them remember which herbs to use for which complaints. In monasteries, the herbalist monks moved through their gardens with quiet deliberation, their habits brushing against rows of thyme and oregano, murmuring prayers as they harvested. In villages, lay herbalists might work barefoot in small kitchen plots, their hands stained green from handling fresh leaves. The relationship between herbalist and plant was one of respect, for for they knew that the same herb that could heal in the right dose might harm if misused. And so they measured and prepared with care, grinding powders with slow, even strokes, straining infusions through cloth, and tasting cautiously to judge strength. In the cool months, the focus shifted to dispensing remedies: teas for winter coughs, poultices for sprains, salves for chapped skin, and syrups sweetened with honey to soothe sore throats. Their patients trusted them not only for cures, but for counsel, for herbalists often carried the accumulated wisdom of their communities, advising on diet, daily habits, and ways to avoid illness. Through these quiet, persistent labors, they maintained a bridge between the natural world and human well-being, one that endured year after year, as steady as the turning of the seasons themselves. In many parts of medieval Europe, the herbalist's work was shaped not only by the seasons, but also by the ebb and flow of local life, for their role in the community went far beyond the gathering and preparation of plants. They were often called upon to attend to childbirth, easing labor with infusions of raspberry leaf or soothing a mother afterward with calming lavender and chamomile. They treated wounds from farm work or small skirmishes with poultices of comfrey and plantain, their fingers moving with practiced care as they bound cloth strips soaked in herbal solutions. They prepared tonics to strengthen the weak during long winters, often blending warming spices like ginger and cinnamon, imported at great cost along the trade routes, with locally gathered roots and berries. Payment for these services was rarely in coin. More often it came in the form of bread, cheese, eggs, or a share of the next harvest, exchanged with the quiet understanding that the herbalist's knowledge was as valuable as any physical good. In towns, they sometimes worked alongside apothecaries, supplying fresh or dried ingredients that would be incorporated into more elaborate compounds. In monasteries, their efforts were part of a wider commitment to charity and hospitality, ensuring that both locals and travelers could find relief when illness struck. The herbalist's work also had a role in preventative care, though the term itself was not yet in use. They taught people how to use herbs in cooking to maintain health, recommending rosemary and meats for digestion, parsley to freshen breath, and garlic to strengthen the body against disease. Many herbalists were also skilled in making vinegars, wines, and oils infused with herbs, which served both medicinal and culinary purposes, bridging the line between healing and nourishment. Their knowledge often extended to preserving foods for the winter, understanding that good nutrition was as important as treating sickness once it appeared. While their remedies drew on centuries of accumulated wisdom, they remained open to new ideas, adopting plants introduced through trade or conquest, such as saffron, introduced from the East, into their practices once their effects had been observed. In their small, cluttered workrooms, the herbalists moved with unhurried precision, measuring by sight and feel, grinding powders until they were fine enough to dissolve easily, or stirring thick ointments over low flames until the texture was just right. There was no rush in their work, for the plants themselves kept their own pace, growing and maturing in their time. And the herbalist's task was to match that rhythm, neither hurrying nor delaying beyond what nature allowed. In this way, their craft became a living example of patience and attentiveness, qualities that earned them a quiet respect among those who depended on their skill, season after season, year after year. As winter settled over the countryside and the days grew short, the work of the herbalist shifted from gathering to tending the stores carefully collected through the warmer months. For in these cold, still weeks, the jars and bundles hanging from the rafters became the lifeline for those who fell ill. The workroom was often warmed only by a small hearth, and the air carried the mingled scents of dried sage, rosemary, and thyme, their aromas mingling with the faint sweetness of honey, used in syrups and lozenges. On a narrow table, the herbalist might spread out parchment sheets to check the inventory, ensuring that the supplies of elderberry were still ample for winter coughs, that the dried rose hips retained their tartness for teas, rich in strength, giving vitamin content, and that the comfrey roots were still firm enough to grind into a healing paste. On the coldest days, when snow drifted against the walls, the herbalist would prepare remedies meant to comfort as much as cure, mulled wines infused with warming spices for the weary, or thick salves for chapped skin caused by frost and wind. Visits from neighbors often came in the form of a knock at the door, followed by the sight of someone clutching a basket, bringing an offering in trade for a needed cure. The herbalist would listen patiently to their ailments, asking quiet questions about how long the symptoms had lasted, what foods had been eaten, and whether others in the household were ill. These conversations were part of the diagnosis, for without the instruments of later centuries, the herbalist relied on careful observation, the tone of a voice, the pallor of skin, or the warmth of a forehead touched lightly by the back of the hand. Sometimes the remedy was simple, a tisane brewed from chamomile and mint for an unsettled stomach, or a poultice of mashed garlic and vinegar for an inflamed wound, while other times it required blending several herbs, each chosen to balance the humors believed to be disturbed. When not meeting with patients, the herbalist might spend long hours repairing storage containers, tightening lids to keep out moisture, or retying the bundles of herbs to ensure they would last until spring. Books, if the herbalist had them, were brought closer to the fire for copying or study, the pages turned with care to prevent damage from the dry winter air. Knowledge, like the herbs themselves, had to be preserved, for it was the foundation of their craft and the means by which their communities endured. And so, even in the quietest months of the year, the herbalist's hands were never idle, working steadily in harmony with the slow, deliberate pace of the season, guided always by the belief that each leaf, root, and seed had its place in the healing order of the world. As the first hints of spring began to stir in the land, the herbalist's attention turned once more to the world beyond the workroom walls, for the earth, still cool and damp from the thawing frost, was beginning to offer the earliest signs of life. The herbalist would rise early, stepping out into the pale morning light with a basket slung over one arm, moving slowly along the familiar paths that wound through meadow, woodland, and streamside. These early excursions were not hurried. Each step was measured, the eyes scanning for the delicate shoots that signaled the return of plants long awaited after the long winter. Coltsfoot, with its bright yellow flowers, would appear before its leaves, offering both a cheerful sight and the promise of remedies for coughs and congestion. Dandelion greens, tender and new, could be gathered for their cleansing properties, often added to broths to help restore vitality after months of preserved food. The herbalist would bend low to inspect the first sprigs of yarrow pushing through the soil, noting their feathery leaves and imagining the poultices they would become in the months ahead. In the hedgerows, buds began to swell on elder branches, a quiet promise of summer blooms that would later yield berries rich in medicinal use. Each find was noted in the mind, a careful mapping of where and when certain plants emerged, for this knowledge, accumulated over years, was as valuable as the plants themselves. Back in the workshop, preparations for the growing season began in earnest. Wooden shelves were cleared to make room for fresh harvests, pestle and mortar were cleaned of the fine dust from last year's grinding, and cloth bags for drying herbs were mended or replaced. Seeds saved from previous years were examined for viability, and where necessary, the herbalist might seek out exchanges with other keepers of the craft, trading a measure of dried chamomile for seeds of a rare medicinal plant. As the days grew warmer, the herbalist might plant small kitchen plots near the dwelling, carefully placing herbs like sage, marjoram, and fennel in the most favorable spots for sunlight and drainage, knowing that a plant well situated would yield more potent medicine. The tending of these plants was done with quiet patience, watering at dawn, removing encroaching weeds by hand, and watching for signs of disease or insect damage. Evenings were spent recording observations in simple notes or marking lunar phases that might guide future planting. For many in that era, believed that the cycles of the moon influenced the growth and strength of plants. The herbalist moved through these days with a steady rhythm, balancing the joy of the new season with the understanding that each plant's time was fleeting, and the work of preservation would soon be at hand again. In this way, the year turned, each season bringing its own duties, each plant returning like an old acquaintance, and the knowledge of their ways growing ever deeper in the hands of those who listened closely to the land. By the time summer had fully settled over the countryside, the herbalist's world was alive with abundance, the fields and woodlands filled with scents and colors that marked the busiest and most rewarding time of the year. The early mornings began before the sun had fully risen, when the air was still cool and the plants held the night's dew upon their leaves, for it was well known that harvesting in the freshness of dawn helped preserve the oils and essences that gave each herb its strength. Basket in hand, the herbalist would walk familiar routes, pausing to gather meadowsweet with its delicate, creamy blossoms, a plant valued for easing fevers and soothing pain. Along the sunny edges of paths, St. John's wort revealed its bright yellow petals, which, when pressed into oil, would produce a rich red infusion used for wounds and skin ailments. In shaded groves, the herbalist might find woodruff, its sweet scent lingering even after drying, useful for gentle tonics. Streamsides yielded watermint and valerian, each plant demanding careful handling to ensure its potency remained intact. Every cutting was done with respect, never stripping a patch entirely, but taking only enough to serve the needs of the season. For the balance between use and renewal was an unspoken rule that guided the hands of those who worked closely with the land. Back at the workroom, the air was filled with the mingled aromas of herbs laid out to dry, each tied in small bundles and hung upside down from beams, their leaves whispering softly whenever the warm air shifted. Large earthenware jars were lined on shelves, ready to be filled with dried petals, roots, and seeds, each labeled in neat, careful script. Oils were slowly infused in glass vessels set in warm, sunlit windows, their colors deepening day by day, while mortar and pestle saw constant use in grinding herbs into fine powders for salves and teas. In the afternoons, when the sun was high and the work of gathering paused, the herbalist might tend to the garden plots, ensuring that the cultivated herbs like rosemary, sage, and thyme were thriving. Weeds were removed by hand, water carried from nearby wells or streams was poured gently at the base of plants, and a quiet watch was kept for signs of pests that could threaten the year's supply. Evenings brought another kind of labor, careful recording of what had been gathered, noting where certain plants grew best and in what quantities, for such records would serve not only the herbalist, but future generations. The long days passed in the steady rhythm, the senses always alert to changes in the land, for a sudden storm could flatten a field of delicate blossoms, and an unusually hot week could dry a stream that nourished water-loving plants. Yet in the height of summer, when storerooms grew fuller each day and the scent of herbs lingered in the very fabric of clothing, there was also a quiet satisfaction. Each jar, each bundle, each bottle represented not just a plant, but the time, patience, and knowledge that transformed the bounty of the earth into remedies that would serve through the coming months. As summer began its slow turn toward late August, the herbalist's work shifted subtly but decisively, for this was the moment to prepare for the transition from the season of growth to the season of preservation. The days were still long, but the light carried a different quality, softer and tinged with gold in the early mornings and evenings, signaling that the most productive gathering weeks were coming to an end. The herbalist knew that certain plants would soon lose their potency, and so the final harvest of summer herbs became a task requiring precision. Fields of chamomile, their small white and yellow blossoms swaying gently, were carefully stripped of flowers to be dried for winter teas. Elderberries, dark and glossy, were collected in bunches for syrups and cordials to strengthen the body against cold weather ailments. In the kitchen garden, sage leaves were clipped in the cool of morning, their silvery surfaces catching the first rays of the sun, while thyme, with its tiny purple blooms, was gathered in handfuls and spread on linen cloths to dry. Some herbs, like angelica and comfrey, demanded that their roots be dug now, while the ground was still soft from summer rains, for their strength would wane once the plants began directing energy into seed and stem. Along with gathering, the herbalist turned to the work of blending, combining dried petals with roots and seeds to create specific remedies stored in parchment-lined boxes or small glazed jars. A cough remedy might contain coltsfoot, licorice root, and a touch of honey, while a digestive tonic could be prepared from fennel seeds, peppermint, and dried orange peel. In these preparations, every ingredient had its role, and the herbalist relied on memory and practice more than written instructions, for the knowledge had been passed down through demonstration, not solely through words. Outside, the garden itself began to show signs of change. Some annual herbs grew sparse, their flowering complete, while others like rosemary and bay remained evergreen, promising their leaves even through the cold months. The herbalist walked through the rows, cutting back spent stalks, saving seeds in small cloth pouches, and making note of which plants had thrived and which would need a better position or richer soil in the next planting. There was a rhythm to the work that was both physical and mental, lifting baskets, bending to gather, rising to tie bundles, then pausing to record the day's harvest in careful script. As the sun dipped lower each evening, the drawing room grew ever more crowded, the air thick with mingled scents of mint, lavender, marigold, and the deeper, earthier fragrance of roots and bark. Each jar sealed and each bundle hung represented security against the uncertainties of winter, a quiet assurance that the household and surrounding community would be prepared for illnesses and discomforts in the months ahead. And though the season of gathering was drawing to a close, the herbalist felt a deep contentment, for the shelves that had been bare in spring now stood heavy with the patient work of an entire summer. By the time autumn's chill began to settle into the mornings, the herbalist's work turned toward the final and perhaps most meticulous stage of the year, sealing away the last of the season's harvest and ensuring that every root, leaf, and seed was properly stored for the long months ahead. The countryside itself had shifted in color, with green giving way to a tapestry of golds, russets, and muted browns, and the air carried the scent of fallen leaves mingled with the faint smoke of distant hearth fires. This was the season for gathering what the summer had left behind, the sturdy plants that thrived in cooler air and the fruits that ripened late. Rose hips, bright and red, were plucked carefully from hedgerows, their sharp thorns demanding patience, and taken back to be dried for teas rich in the nourishment that would be needed in the depths of winter. Hawthorn berries were collected in the same manner, destined for syrups believed to strengthen the heart. In woodland edges, the herbalist might still find clusters of nettles, their sting lessened by the season, but their leaves still useful when dried and crumbled for broths. Roots became a priority now, burdock, dandelion, and valerian, dug from damp soil, cleaned of clinging earth, and sliced into thin strips to dry slowly over the hearth. Each root carried a different quality, some for cleansing, some for calming, some for fortifying the body's strength. Indoors, the herbalist inspected the drying racks, feeling for any lingering dampness in leaves or petals, for moisture was the enemy that could cause a year's work to mold and spoil. Jars were stoppered with wax or sealed with cloth and twine, each labeled with the name of the plant and the date of its gathering. These labels, written in a steady hand, were as important as the contents themselves, for they carried the memory of the plant's best moment of potency. Beyond medicines, the herbalist also prepared herbs for cooking, bundles of sage for roasting meats, sprigs of thyme and marjoram to flavor soups, and crushed coriander and caraway for bread. There was a satisfaction in knowing that the year's work touched not just the sick room, but also the table, blending nourishment and healing into the rhythm of daily life. In the evenings, as daylight faded early, the herbalist often sat by the fire, sorting seeds for the next year's planting, rubbing them free from dried pods, and spreading them to dry further before tucking them into small cloth packets. There was a quiet pleasure in these tasks, a sense of continuity that reached beyond a single season. Outside, frost began to touch the grass, and the fields lay still, awaiting the rest of winter. The gardens were mostly bare now, save for a few hardy plants that stood as green reminders of the year's abundance. Looking over shelves lined with jars, baskets, and neatly labeled bundles, the herbalist felt a deep calm. The cycle had been completed once again: seed to plant, plant to harvest, harvest to remedy. And now, as the cold set in, the knowledge that the work would begin anew in spring brought a steady, enduring contentment, as reliable as the turning of the seasons themselves. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again tomorrow night.